Welcome in. I'm Colette Wieland alongside Dr. Stephen Camarata. Steve is an expert in late talking children and child development. You're also a parent, author, late talker himself. So far, if you're just joining this conversation, the last few episodes we've been going over common labels that are often given to children who are late talkers. And one of those is ADHD. So let's first of all break down those letters. ADHD, what does that mean?
So AD is attention deficit, H is hyperactivity, and D is disordered. So it's attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And so that's the acronym ADHD. And we think of it like from a differential diagnostic standpoint is attention deficit is when the child is not able to filter out distractors when they are engaged. So what we do for that when we're assessing it is the child's playing with something that they're really interested in, they're paying attention to it, and then you have a distractor on the peripheral of their visual system or out here. And typically what's going to happen is we're going to filter that out and not pay attention to it. The child with attention deficit, part of the AD, part of the ADHD, they will stop what they're doing, even if they're really excited and motivated to do it, and they'll go and attend to that. So they cannot inhibit distractors or, these, they cannot, modulate their attention. And then hyperactivity disorder, if you watch a toddler and you even try to like follow them and do what they do, you will be exhausted because little toddlers have motors. But these are people that move way more than you would expect, even for somebody who's pretty active. And the way we do that is, again, we have the child engaged in an activity that they're interested in. And it's amazing. What happens is that after, a few seconds, usually 30 seconds or a minute, they get up and they move and then they come back. They cannot sit still and engaged in a preferred activity. So those are our two different markers for it. And again, if you think about a toddler, and you call their name, they're not going to respond. This is over and above, what you would expect in typical toddlers or preschoolers. And so I'll just stop there and take more questions. But the basic idea is that the child cannot inhibit distractors and or they cannot inhibit movement. That's the basic framework that we use for looking at it.
I was reading that there are different kinds of ADHD, specifically 3. Mm-hmm. Attention, hyperactivity, and mixed.
Correct. Yes.
So what would you like to say about those 3 different types?
So you it's kind of what I just described, but let's be more specific. So the idea is that there are children who can sit, but they can't inhibit distractors. So they can inhibit the movement, impulse to move. So they have the attention type, subtype of ADHD. And there's other children that they can really focus and they don't necessarily get distracted, but they have to get up and move. It just makes you tired watching them. Right. And by the way, when one of these kids comes into your assessment room, it's going to be like a tornado went through. They're going to get every toy out and play with every toy. And then the mixed type is, nature's double whammy. So they are, can inhibit distractors and they have an impulse to move. So when there's a distractor, they're going to get up and move, and they're going to keep moving because they have that motor. That's the H in the ADHD.
And I know you just said this, toddlers, hard to say if they have just normal toddler development or ADHD. So when is really the first time you can kind of identify that?
Again, it's like many things, like classic autism, like intellectual disability. If it's in its most pronounced form, you can absolutely see that a toddler is hyperactive. I mean, it's just toddlers are active anyway, but the hyperactive toddlers are just they're nonstop. And it's kind of interesting. You watch them; they're nonstop, and then they literally just fall asleep on the floor. It's like they reach their threshold and then they just crash. So the more subtle forms of ADHD, absolutely true, difficult to differentiate in a toddler, especially when they're late talking, because a late talker may not be as amenable to listening to people. Many children with autism, it's difficult. Is it the autism or is it the hyperactivity? Those are difficult. But with regard to, like the most extreme forms of ADHD, you can absolutely find it in toddlers, and I have certainly seen it.
Equal amount of boys and girls?
Way more in boys. Depending on who you read, the ratio, like in any 100 people with ADHD, it's going to be 75% boys or more. And the girls tend to be more of the attention type than either the mixed type or the hyperactive type. The boys are kind of equally distributed.
I want to talk about the causes of ADHD. Is there a genetic link in families? Are there environmental causes?
There are genetic links. So parents that are more active can tend to have hyperactive children, or parents that have, attention problems can we don't have a...
So like a parent who's been diagnosed with ADHD is more likely to have a child with ADHD?
Yes, that's true. Although they also have a lot that aren't. So it's not like a one gene or two gene situation. It's a kind of a complicated thing, but it's kind of like late talking. Late talking runs in families, but we don't necessarily know the exact genes for late talking. Or autism's the same way. We know there's genetic switches, if you will, or heritability indices, but we don't know the specific genes at this point. We're still working on that, or not me, but other people are. So one of my favorite studies was done by Mark Woolrich. He was at Vanderbilt, then he went to University of Oklahoma. He's a developmental pediatrician. He had kids with ADHD, and he had regular kids eat a lot of sugar, and it did not cause ADHD. We all think that if you sugar the kids up, and I can say as a grandparent, I totally love the sugar up the grandkids paradigm.
And then send them home.
Right, exactly. But he found that, sugar doesn't cause ADHD, which I thought was interesting, because I certainly thought that it did prior to his study coming out. But, certainly some children have food sensitivities. Sometimes kids are sensitive to different medications. So there are certainly lots of things that can be triggers for ADHD.
Those would be environmental causes?
They would be, yeah. We don't have a specific set of, say, toxins. So we know like chronic lead exposure, sadly, can, cause intellectual disability. If children have these long-term exposures to lead, that's a straight line toxic heavy metal sequelae that we know is bad. But we don't have necessarily specific environmental toxins that relate to ADHD. But certainly, there are environmental causes. Like I said, reactions to medication and so on can actually be related to ADHD.
Who can properly diagnose a child with ADHD? Because I have some friends who say, their teachers have called them up and said their kid's acting up, and they should probably get screened for that. So who should we be relying on? So
basically, a diagnosis of ADHD really should be performed by a medical person, or it could be some child psychologists have that training. Speech pathologists generally aren't trained in it, and occupational therapists aren't necessarily trained in differential. And so certainly when I see a child who has ADHD, I'm going to make that referral. My hit rate is really high because I've been trained to recognize it, but I wouldn't provide that diagnosis. I would say, your child seems really more active. I think it's affecting their learning and their late talking, but I really want you to see your pediatrician and follow up on this to see if that's what we need to do. So school should not be diagnosing ADHD. And one of the things I've argued, and my colleague Bill Barbaresi, who's a developmental pediatrician at Harvard at Boston Children's, has also done a ton of studies. And, the ADHD symptoms can be variable depending on the context. And so is it really ADHD if a child can't sit still in school because of maybe a mismatch between the teaching and the child's temperament?
Bored, right?
If they're bored, right, exactly. So if I'm, the thing I talk about is if you did circle time with, I'm not good with circle time anyway, but if you did circle time with me in Spanish, I'd be really wiggly. All of us would. And so we want to think about if the way the school is teaching is actually kind of making them think there's an ADHD component here when in fact it's not. Now, having said that, there is such a thing as ADHD. And, certainly teachers are really good at sensing whether, a child is more active or less active than their peers. So I'm not discounting that out of hand, but the teacher shouldn't be the one to say your child has ADHD. They can say, I'm seeing some differences in your child. Can you follow that up? That's kind of the way the conversation should go. One of the stories I tell is that when my late talking son was in second grade, he has a severe receptive language problem. When she's reading stories, and this teacher won Teacher of the Year award in Nashville. She's phenomenal, great teacher, and also a very good singer. So she would read, and it was very attentive. Every child is sitting in there with their eyes on her. Meanwhile, my son is moving around the classroom. And so her thought was, oh, he must have ADHD. But what it was is his comprehension problem was then he couldn't understand what she was saying, so then he was wiggly. He would sit still for hours and do art, and you could put a bomb off, and he wouldn't be distracted by it. And he would sit and not move for hours. So he didn't meet the basic description of ADHD, which is when you're engaged in a preferred activity, can you inhibit an impulse to move, and can you inhibit distractors? In his case, absolutely 100%. So that wasn't it. But because she didn't understand that he had a problem understanding language, she didn't really have that in her toolkit, and she knew he was having problems, she immediately went to that. Okay, and so that's the important thing. Now, I will say, and you know, this is my recollection, and it's been a while. That son is now in his 30s, but what I remember is that she was also kind of talking about getting medication for him, you know, and you know, kind of pushing that. And I worry that schools might be suggesting either directly or indirectly that you go down a medical route, and that really is something that should be done by a physician. You really shouldn't be taking the teacher's advice on whether your child should be medicated or not. So if the teacher says, hey, I see a learning difference in your child, pay attention. Teachers are great, and they see these kinds of things. As to exactly what it is, particularly if it's ADHD, you know, just be sure you're following that up with a differential medical diagnosis by a qualified professional.
Well, in the case of your son, he had a language disorder.
He had a language disorder.
And so that's pretty common, right? For kids to be misdiagnosed with ADHD when actually they have a language disorder.
Right, exactly. And so that is, I mean, and that's why you want to think about it. There was a study that came out several years ago, and again, going from memory, 1 in 8 boys in our schools is medicated for ADHD, and that is absolutely ridiculous. And I'll just say that up front. If you look around the world, you look at countries in Europe, Scandinavia that have way better educational outcomes than we do, their medication rates are 1 in 500, 1 in 200, 1 in 1,000. Nobody's, you know, even 1 in 50. So somehow the American education interface is, you know, resulting in our boys being medicated for ADHD, and you have to wonder about that, why that's happening, and you know, why should the U.S. have all this ADHD? And one could argue that it's a mismatch really in that education kind of style, and then the way that boys learn is one tenable hypothesis. I can't prove that, but that's one thing we should be thinking about.
And I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of an argument over whether medication is the answer, but there's some cases where it's needed, right? Where it's necessary.
Yeah, I have to be really careful here. I'm not medically trained. I am, you know, trained in research and reviewing research, and my review of the research, and again, check this with a pediatrician, developmental pediatrician, my understanding is that medication can be effective, but oftentimes it's not effective or actually can make it worse. And so you want to be sure that you're working with your pediatrician to, you know, understand what kind of medication and, you know, whether they're getting the right dosing, and you want to see if the child's medication is, you know, working in certain situations and not in others. You want to do that detective work. But I will say the literature, as my understanding of it, is not an expert now, but somebody who reviews research, is that it can help, but it can also hurt. And so you want to think about that, or it may not have any effect. So you want to think about that. I'll also say that a lot of the teenagers I work with, the late talking teenagers who also have ADHD, they really don't want to be in their medication over the weekend. So they themselves have some, you know, like they don't really necessarily care for the medication. And you have to think about as your child gets older that they actually are a partner in addressing it. We do know, and this part I am an expert on as a behaviorist, we can also improve ADHD symptoms using behavioral interventions that aren't necessarily medication.
That's
my
what
own
I want to
bias.
ask you about.
Okay,
yeah.
go ahead.
No, so if medication, let's put that aside. What are those treatments specifically?
Yeah, so I want to be careful here. This is a bias because of my training and because I'm not medically trained. So normally what I do when I'm dealing with a late talker who has ADHD is I'm going to start off with a behavioral support, and I'm then going to go to medication if that fails. So I'm always going to go to behavior first, and that's my toolkit. Okay, so I want to, you know, maybe there's advantage to go to medication first. I can't really argue that either way. I'm telling you kind of how I manage
your experience, sure.
My experience, right. So it's really straightforward. So first thing is, you know, When are the symptoms of the ADHD worse? When are they better? And you do that detective work. And then you think about, are there times when the child isn't moving? Are there times when the child is attending? And then you think about how to harness that for other situations. And really, just to not get really technical, basically what we do is we start off, and this is called behavioral shaping. We start off with just having them sit still and attend and complete a task of low motivation, maybe a worksheet or something they don't like to do. And we do it just for a short amount of time. And then we let them escape, And then, we come back and we slowly increase the amount of time where they attend in order to get the reward. So what we might do is if they like a video game, I'd say, okay, we're going to do this set of 10 math problems, for example. We're going to do 3 of those, and then you get to play the video game for 2 minutes. Then we're going to do 5 of them. We just gradually increase their attention and so we're very product oriented, and that's very effective. So behavioral interventions can be very effective with some of the kids with ADHD. Others, no matter how much you incentivize them, they can't inhibit the impulse to move or the distractors. And that's when we were saying, hey, we need to bring in a physician for this.
What is the most important thing that you want parents to know if their child is given an ADHD label?
Yeah. So what's really important is, number one, is the ADHD only at school? And then what does that tell you? Is it really? So you want to check that out. You want to think that through. I have a lot of parents say, my child really at home doesn't move that much, and they sit and they attend, and so the first thing is, as like anything else, maybe get a second opinion and just see if it's valid. And then if it in fact is ADHD, then what you want to do, and again, we wrote this review about late talking and ADHD, and what it means is that, we know how to improve talking and understanding and social interaction, and in that child with ADHD, it means that we have to think about the challenges the ADHD provides. And so when a child isn't attending, they're missing important learning cues. So we have to do more of those learning cues and make the learning more redundant so that when they are attending, it gets uptaken into their long-term memory. And we want to structure the room. We want to structure the learning so that if they have an impulse to move, we can help them inhibit that. And then if on medication, we would look and see, hey, are they able to attend and not move when they're on the medication? We'll actually kind of feed that back to the physician. So what it does is it informs how you're going to support that child. It's an extra thing you have to think about in your developmental, perspective on how you're teaching the late talking and how you're teaching other information.
What kind of successful environments do you see with those treatments, the behavior? What kind of environment helps put that child up for success, right?
So the thing I always like to remind parents is your child isn't a label, and you're doing the detective work to figure out how they learn best and how they learn worse. So you can do more of how they learn best and less of how they learn worse. And that's really, we don't want to let the label be deterministic. And so the idea is that, okay, so like if I have a child with ADHD who's language disordered, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, I've got to teach him vocabulary. We teach verbs, we teach word endings, we teach complex syntax. I have to do more of that. I have to think about different ways. Maybe I'll harness the fact that they're moving. Maybe I'm going to teach them on a playground. They go and they play and come back, and I'm going to intersperse my teaching trials around movement. I'm going to think about how to meet that child where they are in order to give them optimal teaching examples for the language structures I'm trying to help them learn.
So what I'm kind of hearing is that a traditional classroom may not always be the best setting for a child with ADHD.
It may not. And there are classrooms, one that comes to mind is Waldorf, where they have exercise built in. Interestingly enough, we have tons of studies to show that when a child does, all children do exercise, they have a half an hour to an hour after the exercise where their learning is optimized. So interspersing exercise is always indicated for every child, but especially in ADHD. So more movement-based types of things. One of my favorite kind of vignettes was there was a dancer, and I'm not remembering her name, and I hadn't thought of it till just now, but she was in a regular school, and she clearly had hyperactivity, and so she was from England, and so they just put her in ballet and dance class, and she became a world-class ballerina or dancer. I think she was a ballerina. And so, part of it is like meeting your child where they are, and then thinking about, maybe this young man is going to end up being a tradesman working outside on construction and being able to move and things like that. And I don't mean that in a deterministic or negative way. It's like, how are we going to optimize learning? The Nashville School for the Arts has a lot of children that really are into movement and so on, and they're able to accommodate that, and channel it like the dancer I mentioned. So you want to think about that, and you want to meet the children where they are, and you also want to give them strategies for, okay, you have this movement impulse. Now, how are you going to handle it? You want to turn over management to them over time.
I'm not an expert, but I have read a couple of reports on movement, specifically being outside and just like normal developing, and not even specific to ADHD, that if you spend more time outside moving, you're actually smarter. It was scored better on this like a specific test, right?
So we have a ton of studies on that, and basically, for example, if you have children go and they run around a track, for half a mile, and you do a learning task, you do the learning task before they run, you do the learning task after, they learn better after the exercise. That's really replicated over and over again. And it's also true in animal studies. I mean, this is a very hard finding.
What is it that changes and helps?
Yeah, so the physiology of it's actually, the good thing about animal studies is then people can actually ask these questions in a physiological way. And so the exercise actually changes basically some important synaptic compounds. I'll just say it that way. I don't want to get too. But it basically provides a period of calm in the brain. So getting the exercise and movement actually has a positive benefit on being ready to learn, and there are neurological reasons for that.
So recess is important.
And actually our schools have moved away from recess, and given the increase in obesity, and then also thinking about how we want to help children learn and optimize their learning, it just doesn't make any sense to take away recess. And oftentimes our kids with ADHD, like their punishment for moving is they lose recess. And it's like, don't do that. That's
totally
a bad idea.
Right,
exactly. We don't want to reward them for adverse behaviors. I'm all... I understand that we have to do behavior management, but we don't want to take away the very things that are going to help them manage their learning difference. That doesn't make any sense at all, but that's what happens sometimes in practice.
I think that's great advice, Steve. Next week, we're going to talk about another label children often received, and that is an intellectual disability. So please join us for that as we wrap up our discussion on labels. In the meantime, you can drop your questions below in that comment section. Click subscribe so we can keep getting information to you. And please hit that bell. Of course, you can always go to the Late Talkers Foundation website.
And always remember, the best thing for your child is you.